I'll say one word: evolution. Human beings are evolved in a world that is slow changing. And so they tend to focus on, they discount future events, they focus on the present because the current circumstances in which they find themselves are the ones they need to focus on in order to survive. I got to get food, I got to get water, I got to protect my tribe, my family, I've got to protect myself. Those are all immediate needs. And so if we didn't have that orientation, we wouldn't have made it this far, because that's a very successful adaptation. Now, that adaptation doesn't work very well when you're in a biosphere that is quickly changing, and that's what we're facing now. We're not evolutionarily designed to deal with fast-changing external circumstances. We're evolved to change to deal with very, very slow-changing systems. Now, we have this cultural adaptation, which is this fabulous form of communication called speech, and now we have extended it so that it becomes electronic and everybody can have access to it. So I'm not saying that it's hopeless. I'm saying that our basic instincts are to focus on the present, not the future. Let somebody else worry about the future, because after all, I have to survive today. There is an opening for us because of this cultural adaptation called language and the internet that allows us to think more clearly about possibilities in the future and maybe adapt to them. But consider this. If you adapt to peak oil today, you bring your lifestyle down 80%. You bring your consumption down 80%. And then peak oil occurs in 2040. People are going to wonder, you're going to wonder why you did all that. So this is how people, again, begin to try to assess the future. Well, I may not have to do that. I may not have to deal with that. Those are the kinds of sort of inbuilt barriers that I think are there.
My answer is that our modern human evolution has disconnected us from nature, and we are disconnected from source. And when we start to design systems that significantly account for nature's success as being intertwined with our success, we'll start to see some pretty big changes. And that's measurable stuff when we start to measure organic matter in the soil percentages, when we start to measure percentages of carbon sequestered. There's another great permaculturist by the name of Jeff Lawton who says that all the world's problems can be solved in a garden. And most people don't know that, and it makes them very insecure. And I would agree with that.
My name is Chris Bedford. I am from Montague, Michigan. I have like a two-part question. Michigan has got a renewable portfolio standard of 10%. Wisconsin's got 25%. It's kind of interesting, the difference. And that difference can be accounted for the fact that two large corporations, DTE and Consumers, control energy, electrical energy policy, have a monopoly, which we just gave back to them. And so they are in charge of our energy policy. So my first part of the question is, what do we do about that? Their corporate interests really deciding our energy policy as opposed to maybe a general public interest? And then the second part of it is, in every equation we talk about politically in Michigan, we talk about the need for jobs and for new jobs and job creation. And invariably, politicians link cheap energy to job creation. So what do we do about that?
Boy, those are good observations. Maybe it's good that I retired 2 weeks ago. And I don't know how many times Michigan gets compared to Wisconsin, and actually it's a fair comparison for obvious reasons. It's, if you're going to compare Michigan to any state, you should compare it to probably Wisconsin. There are different things in Michigan, including the fact that we have two big utilities, very big utilities, and they do have a significant amount of influence in Lansing. Years ago, I ran into a utility lobbyist in Lansing, and I said, because they were working on the RPS, and I said, hey, I was joking with him. I said, I heard you've hired every lobbyist in Lansing to kind of work on this issue. And he said, yeah, we have. We've hired every lobbyist to work on this issue in our perspective. Are they lobbyists that know Republicans, lobbyists that know Democrats? I wish I had a solution to kind of this question, because it's just not energy. I mean, businesses have interests. It's a free country. They should represent their interests. A lot of us would probably say they have disproportionate influence. And, you know, the only way to deal with that is individual action. And I do believe that, you know, legislators listen to local folks. So there is a certain amount of power there. I'm not saying it's easy. I'll leave it there. It's what you've identified is a major. It's the crux of our issue with respect to what are we going to do in the state of Michigan? Are we going to have more coal power plants? Are we going to have more wind power? Are we going to have more efficiency? And the folks who kind of represent what I'll call traditional industry are well represented. I guess the good news, though, is you do have big companies. General Electric comes to mind, John Deere for a while in wind power, that are now into renewable energy. And so that's kind of interesting that it's not just the lone poor consumer at the table now. You have some business interests which are actually have a broader perspective than the traditional industries.
You mentioned the connection between cheap energy and jobs, and one of our big challenges is just to get people to understand that cheap energy is not what we're going to have going forward. So I talked a little bit about the petroleum side. It's going to be the same thing with coal, in part because of the subsidies that they currently enjoy. So we have to talk about the comparison between the alternatives that don't have the subsidy versus the fossil-based energy that does, not to mention the fact that going forward, just for the reasons we've talked about, that fossil fuels will become more expensive.
I'll just say one thing on this, and that it is at first puzzling why business interests that are big consumers of electricity and natural gas in Michigan and elsewhere don't band together and say, wait a minute, this energy policy is crazy for us. And I think the answer is an answer that I gave just a little bit ago, and that is those business organizations are run by people who think in the short term. They're not thinking about 10 years or 20 years. Very few business people think that far ahead. There are a few, and when they do that, they actually tend to be quite a bit more successful. But if you're running a publicly traded company, your focus is on making your bonus as big as it possibly can be. And so you're not worried about how the renewable energy portfolio is going to work out 10 or 20 or 30 years from now. You're worried about what's my paycheck going to be next quarter.
I'll speak to it real quick. I'm definitely guilty of not being as involved in state and federal type legislation and policy issues, but I would again point to small scale community-based solutions. And as a designer, I'm immediately reminded of Buckminster Fuller, who said that to fight against big policy and things like that is misguided energy. What we need to do is design new solutions that make the old ways obsolete. And I think there are examples of communities doing that all over the world.
Good morning. Mark Ludwig from Fenville, Michigan. I'm a big fan of permaculture and have been for a long time. However, I've also been working in outreach to more conventional farmers for a few years now, and I've learned a few things. They're, by and large, older. The farms are much bigger than they used to be and quite consolidated. About 90% of the farmland is held by a very relatively small number of people in this country. How do we take these very sound design concepts and apply that to this giant, frankly, in Michigan especially, very diverse agricultural community with a lot of different things going on, and maybe speak specifically to the context of some of the things that the more mainstream society is expecting from farms these days. There's a lot of talk about biofuels. There's a lot of talk about, the new agricultural green revolution that's going on. Do you see a role, for example, for biotechnology, for transgenic crops? Let's not get embroiled in the corporate culture of Monsanto when we think about this. Is there a role for, increased nitrogen efficiency in corn, heading off the wheat stem rust that broke out of Uganda a couple of years ago and now is threatening the Punjab region, which would be, a socioeconomic and political disaster for those people and for occupying powers in the region, which would be us. How do we take these concepts that we're talking about and actually get them out in the field, on the land, with the people who are actually doing the work, without some, complete change in the ownership of the land to accomplish that? Because I'm at the end of my rope for how we actually get these guys to even cover crop their land and, do the simplest things for sustainability. This permaculture thing is going to be a real hard sell.
I'll start just by saying that people respond to price. When gas was $4 a gallon, they stopped buying SUVs. And gas went down after the recession hit, and Detroit's making SUVs and people are buying them. So people respond largely to price. I think the idea that what you just described of the way things are right now, that's a design that's occurred given certain basic inputs, and one of those inputs was cheap energy. And as long as that's the case in the market, it's going to be really fighting an uphill battle. But as soon as energy gets high and gets sustained, or at least remains highly volatile, and people get used to that idea, then design will happen around that new price point. So that's going to be part of the driver. I think we're going to have to wait and experience before we get a lot of large-scale change, because it's going to have to change. But that's my input on that.
Can I say something? Yeah, I think that it's going to be hard for price to drive those changes as long as there's this whole set of conflicting subsidies that are embedded into the American agricultural and the European agricultural system. As long as you can get paid for doing all the wrong things, why do the right things? So I'm not saying that agricultural practices won't respond to price, but I think you're going to have to look at the whole policy mix in order to get that response that you'd like.
I'd suggest that we're, in a lot of circles, particularly here in Michigan, we're close to reaching a critical mass of people who really care about where their food comes from, especially in younger generations. There's a rash of younger people who want to be farmers now in Michigan. I'd point you to the Michigan Young Farmers Coalition. But I think there's new models emerging of farmers who are completely self-sufficient and who are not dependent on government subsidies. I'd point to someone like Joel Salatin, who's doing work in the Virginia area and is doing rotational grazing to not only provide for himself and hundreds of other families, but is actually doing restorative work to the land using rotational grazing methods and a lot of things that are one excellent book I would really recommend is called One Straw Revolution by a Japanese farmer named Masanobu Fukuoka. But I think we're seeing an influx of young people that care about where their food comes from. And the first thing you kind of mentioned was these old farmers that don't get it. They might not get it until they go away. But there's new people coming up who are very interested in doing things differently.
That is all the time we have for this session. If we could please give our panelists